Well, ASIO Director General Duncan Lewis has warned the Islamic terror threat to Australia is as high as ever. At a Senate estimates hearing, he called the threat the end of the beginning and said it wouldn't end anytime soon. Well, for more on this, let's bring in Professor John Blaxland from the ANU Strategic and Defence Studies Centre in Canberra. Thank you so much for being with us today. Now, as is the usual case, as ISIS loses ground in Syria and in Iraq, we're seeing the group's members lash out elsewhere, Manchester, of course, being the latest.
Indeed, and what we're seeing is a manifestation of a problem that is far greater than just Daesh or ISIS or even Al-Qaeda. It's not just in Syria, it's not just in Manchester, and we've seen this manifest itself even just very recently in a bombing in Jakarta and also in terrorist actions in southern Philippines. So we have a really significant problem that is reflected in Manchester, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, and of course the Director General of ASIO, Duncan Lewis, just warning us about the threats potentially in Australia. Now, Duncan Lewis is a measured man. He speaks with authority. There's nothing in it for him to overcook this problem, if you like. In fact, if anything, there's potential blowback from overstating the case. My sense is that what we're seeing is ASIO has actually been working quite assiduously and working very, very hard, collaborating with the state and federal police forces, nipping in the bud a whole range of potential extremist actions, most of which actually don't get to see the light of day, most of which don't actually feature in the news. But when they do feature in the news, it's essentially a pretty good news story of collaboration. So there's some interesting points of contrast with the report coming out recently following the Lint siege in Sydney as well.
It is interesting. Now, you've brought up several very interesting points there, of which we shall come back to revisit. But Mr. Lewis also said that we don't see this finishing anytime soon. Now, of course, he was talking about the broader ideology of terrorism. At this moment, the coalition seems to be bombing this ideology, but that doesn't seem to be effective in any way. Should we then be rethinking our strategy against global terrorism? Because after Al-Qaeda, after ISIS, as you said, there will be another terror cell in some other form.
Indeed. Look, we've essentially been playing whack-a-mole in the Middle East for the last 16 years, and it hasn't got us very far. The problem is nobody's come up with a really good alternative strategy other than continuing to whack the moles. Part of the reason is that there is there's an urgent requirement to address the challenges immediately before the security forces. And that's being grappled with in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, and elsewhere in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and even in places like southern Thailand. It's also, as you heard, Duncan Lewis trying to address it here in Australia. The challenge we face, however, is societal. This is bigger than ASIO, it's bigger than federal police, it's bigger than Interpol, it's bigger than any one institution. We know there's been some really good work done on thinking through the way you counter violent extremism. And what we find is that there's no one silver bullet to actually crack the code. There's no one way. I've mixed my metaphors there a bit, but you get my point. This requires a multifaceted approach from governments, state, federal, international, a number of security and intelligence organisations, but also community groups, church groups, society groups, and communities more broadly. This is something that is not going to be solved overnight. But one of the great things when we think about what's happened in Manchester, the silver lining, if you like, to this dark cloud is the extraordinary response of the people. Clearly, we know one of the clear things we know from Daesh or ISIS is their ambition to foment unrest, to tear at social cohesion, to undermine multiculturalism, and to make it about us versus them. Now, interesting to see that not really manifesting itself in Manchester at the moment.
It's certainly very, very interesting in that way. And of course, the community of Manchester has been commended for coming together to try to thwart this ideology of hate. Now, there has, of course, part of the battle against global terrorism is the need to share intelligence. There has been talk of late of the dangers of sharing intelligence. Of course, we've seen some leaks coming out of the White House, coming out of the US officials as well recently over the Manchester investigations. Do you think the United States, by doing so, by leaking this information, is actually jeopardizing intelligence sharing with allies like the United Kingdom and Australia?
Yeah, well, look, let me preface my remarks by putting some historical context on this. Prior to 9/11, there was the principle in the intelligence community was there was the need to know. So if you didn't have a need to know, you didn't get the information. Of course, that led to the 9/11 Commission, which saw the need for agencies to actually start talking to each other. So we then went to this era of the so-called need to share. And so we did share, and there was a lot of sharing going on. And then we had WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden. And what happened? Everybody clammed back up. Why? Because they realised that there was just anybody could get on with a thumb drive, download masses of data and compromise operations, compromise technological procedures and relationships and damage relationships, as Australia's relationship with Indonesia was damaged. So we saw that. We've seen since then a real winding back. So to be fair, there has been a fair amount of caution in the last few years, but now with the Trump administration having apparently a pretty cavalier approach to security from Israel or from the UK or from wherever else next is really causing concern in intelligence circles, in police circles and across the so-called Five Eyes community and beyond with European partners and others as well. So there is a real danger here that the Trump administration's approach to intelligence, which we know was pretty adversarial before he took office, and since then has been really equivocal, is actually problematic. This gets to another important point about the dynamics at work today. When we think, my centre, the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, came out with a book last year called Australia's American Alliance. We talked about the breadth and depth of the relationship, and it is extraordinarily broad and deep. There are many facets to it. But one thing which we rely on in a democracy is for trust and for reliance on what we call soft power, or that ability to actually appeal to the people. And of course we know, we've seen in polling, both in after the Iraq War in 2003 with George W. Bush, but also more recently under the Trump administration, people are seeing the Trump administration as being transactional, as being a little bit unsavoury and quite worrisome. And also for Australia and Southeast Asia, where we live, our patch of the world, equivocal. And we're not sure just where the United States is going to be in terms of its relationships with Australia, Indonesia and the other neighbours. Is it going to do a deal with China that's at the expense of Southeast Asia and Australia? These are big questions that I know the Foreign Minister and the Defence Minister will be looking to address in their OSMIN coming up soon, but they are ones that are deeply troubling to pundits and regular Australians who look at the equation and think, geez, what's going on here? Where are we heading? And what are we getting out of this? It's getting very tricky. Very
uncertain times indeed. But I just want to go back to the US leaking intelligence. Surely there must be a recognition that there could be a blowback against the United States if other allies stop trusting the United States, holding back their intelligence. Would that affect the United States or the rest of the world?
Well, look, it's probably going to affect the rest of the world more than the United States, because the United States is very much the generator of the largest volume of this kind of intelligence. But it undoubtedly will have a negative effect. We need to understand that in this day and age, intelligence is exchanged between police agencies, security agencies, on a trusted basis at an analyst-to-analyst level. It's happening routinely, it's happening almost instantaneously, and it's happening on trusted networks that, material is inserted into it and then it's put out there for other analysts to comment and to provide perhaps corroborating tidbits that can help solve the puzzle more quickly. And if that is corroded, and that seems to be the case at the moment, then that actually undermines the whole international system of international police collaboration and intelligence collaboration, not just with the Five Eyes, but with the trusted networks of other partners and beyond. So this is something the Trump administration will have to look at pretty long and hard at, because there is a serious deficit of trust emerging that is not good for them. It's certainly not good for Australia and its ability to plug in with the United States and other Western countries, noting, of course, that much of the architecture, the infrastructure behind which we cooperate is American-derived.
It's always good talking to you and getting your insight, John Blaxland from the ANU. Thank you.
Thank you, Fawzia.